GSP's Vaseline. One swipe turned a super fight into a rule change. UFC 94 was one of the most hyped events in MMA history. Georges St. Pierre, the welterweight champion, defended his belt against BJ Penn, the lightweight champion, moving up. It was billed as champ versus champ, two of the greatest fighters of all time. Fans expected a war that would be remembered forever. And while the fight itself was dominant for GSP, that isn't what people were talking about afterward. Between rounds, cameras caught GSP's cornerman doing something that looked suspicious. Normally, cutmen put a thin layer of Vaseline on a fighter's face to prevent cuts and reduce friction from punches. But GSP's team wasn't just touching his face. They were rubbing his shoulders, and even his back. That's a major red flag. Vaseline on the body makes you slippery, harder to grab, and nearly impossible to control in grappling. BJ Penn's camp immediately noticed. They exploded in protest, shouting that GSP was greasing to gain an unfair edge. The commission opened an investigation. Dana White himself was furious. He even admitted on camera that Penn's camp had a point. BJ argued it was almost impossible to lock in submissions because GSP felt like he was coated in oil. The fight result wasn't overturned, but the scandal forced big changes. From that moment on, only licensed cutmen were allowed to apply Vaseline. Cornermen were banned from even touching it. The UFC tightened procedures, and officials monitored it closely. To this day, when people talk about UFC 94, the first thing they bring up isn't GSP's dominant win. It's the Vaseline controversy, which shaped how the sport handles fairness and safety forever. Tank Abbott tries to throw a man out of the cage. Early UFC felt less like a sport and more like a bar fight with cameras rolling. Nobody embodied that more than Tank Abbott. He wasn't a polished martial artist. He wasn't there for strategy or respect. Tank was there to cause chaos.
And at UFC 11, he crossed a line nobody thought was possible. Tank fought Cal Worsham that night. After dropping him with heavy punches, Tank decided the fight wasn't violent enough. He picked Worsham up off the ground like a sack of potatoes and tried to literally throw him over the fence and out of the cage. For a few terrifying seconds, it looked like Cal was about to land in the crowd. His body was halfway out before he managed to grab onto the cage padding and hang on for dear life.
The arena gasped. The commentators didn't even know how to react. There were no rules at the time that specifically banned this. Who would have thought a fighter would even try something like that? Afterward, the UFC scrambled to add clear rules banning the act of throwing or ejecting fighters from the fighting area. Tank Abbott walked away, with his reputation as one of the wildest, most dangerous fighters the UFC had ever seen. But the organization knew it couldn't let chaos like that continue. That moment is still replayed in highlight reels today. It shows just how unpredictable the early days were, and how close the UFC came to looking more like professional wrestling than a legitimate sport. Tito and the birth of light heavyweight. Not every big change in the UFC came from chaos. Sometimes it came from its biggest stars. One of those stars was Tito Ortiz. In the late 1990s, Tito wasn't just another fighter. He was the face of the UFC, the guy carrying the promotion on his back. But the weight class system back then was messy. Tito fought in a division called middleweight, which had a 200-pound limit. Cutting down to that weight was brutal. Tito was massive for the division, but the cuts were draining him. Fans could see it. The UFC could see it. Nobody wanted their poster boy passing out on the scale. So when the unified rules of MMA came together in 2001, the UFC used the moment to reshape weight classes. They bumped the 200-pound cap up to 205 and renamed the division light heavyweight. At the same time, they added a proper middleweight at 185 to balance things out. Tito instantly became the king of the new light heavyweight class. He even bragged later that the division existed because of him, and in a way, he was right. This wasn't just a favor to Tito, though. The move created one of the most stacked divisions in MMA history. From Chuck Liddell to John Jones to Daniel Cormier, light heavyweight went on to produce legends. And it all started because Tito Ortiz was too big for middleweight,
Too small for heavyweight, and too important to ignore. Restart in the same position. Sometimes a tiny mistake shows a huge flaw in the rules. UFC 42 gave us one of those moments. Duane Ludwig was fighting, and things weren't going his way. He was stuck on his back, eating shots, with little chance of turning it around. Then, Big John McCarthy stopped the fight. Not to end it, but to let the doctor check a cut. That was normal. What wasn't normal was what happened next. When the doctor gave the green light to continue, the fight didn't resume on the ground where it had stopped. Instead, the fighters were brought back to the center and restarted standing. For Ludwig, it was the break of his life. He went from being trapped on his back to having a fresh start on the feet. He used the momentum swing to rally and eventually win a close decision.
Dana White was livid. Fans were confused. Everyone could see the unfairness. The guy in control lost his advantage for no reason. That single moment forced a big rule change. From then on, fights had to restart in the exact same position they were paused in. If you were in mount, side control, or back mount, that's where it resumed. One mistake created a lasting rule, and it proved just how much details matter in a sport where positions mean everything. Shorts grabbing gets shut down 1998 gave us one of the most awkward fights in UFC history. Pat Miletich fought Mikey Burnett for the first UFC welterweight title. It should have been a historic moment. Instead, fans got 20 minutes of tug-of-war. Both fighters grabbed each other's shorts non-stop. Waistbands stretched, fabric pulled. At one point, referee Big John McCarthy literally stopped the action just to fix Burnett's waistband because it had been yanked halfway off. The fight was slow, sloppy, and hard to watch. Afterward, the UFC made a new rule: no more shorts grabbing. It wasn't just embarrassing, it also gave fighters unfair leverage. Today, grabbing shorts leads to warnings, point deductions, or even disqualifications. There's a funny side note, though. The very same shorts Pat wore that night, the ones stretched and pulled for 20 minutes, later sold on eBay for more than $1,500. Proof that MMA history, even the awkward parts, has value. Shamrock vs. Gracie 2 and the birth of stand-ups. The first fight between Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock at UFC 1 helped launch MMA. Their rematch at UFC 5 almost killed the excitement. The fight went 36 minutes. 36 minutes of Shamrock taking Gracie down, sitting in his guard, and doing almost nothing. He barely threw punches. He didn't try to pass guard. He simply held position. Gracie couldn't do much from the bottom either. With no rounds, no time limits, and no stand-ups for inactivity, the fight turned into a marathon of nothing.
Fans booed. Commentators ran out of things to say. The UFC knew something had to change. After that fight, they introduced time limits and gave referees the authority to stand fighters up if they weren't being active. It was a huge turning point. Without that change, MMA risked becoming a sport of long, boring stalemates. Instead, the rule pushed fighters to stay aggressive and made the product watchable for fans.
Ref stoppages become a thing. It's almost unthinkable today, but in the first UFC events, referees weren't allowed to stop fights. A fight could only end by knockout, submission, or corner stoppage. That rule didn't last long. At UFC 1, Gerard Gordeau knocked out sumo wrestler Taylor Tully with a brutal kick that knocked a tooth into the crowd. The ref stepped in, but technically wasn't supposed to. Then at UFC 2, Pat Smith rained down punches on Scott Morris, who was clearly unconscious, but the ref had to let it continue until the corner threw in the towel. It looked horrifying. Big John McCarthy, who had just started refereeing, went to Rorion Gracie and told him straight up, "If you don't let me stop fights, I won't do this." The UFC listened. By UFC 3, referees had the authority to stop fights when a fighter couldn't defend themselves. That single change introduced the TKO, which today is one of the most common endings in MMA. Judges end the draw era. Even with time limits and stand-ups, the UFC still had a problem. Too many draws. UFC 7 made that clear. Ken Shamrock fought Oleg Taktarov in a cautious, uneventful fight. It went the full distance. The problem? There were no judges. So once again, it ended in a draw. Fans were fed up. Nobody wanted to sit through long fights only to get no winner. By UFC 8, the UFC added judges and adopted the 10-point must scoring system from boxing. They also capped fights at 15 minutes. That one change made a massive difference. It ensured almost every fight had a winner and gave fans closure. Looking back, it's crazy to think MMA once tried to run without judges at all. 12-6 elbows, banned, then unbanned. One motion turned a win into Jon Jones's lone loss. The rule came from a bizarre origin. During the early 2000s, athletic commissions saw a karate demonstration where a man smashed bricks with a straight downward elbow. Doctors thought the strike looked too dangerous and pushed to ban it. Referee Big John McCarthy agreed to compromise. Elbows could stay, but the straight down motion, 12-6 on a clock, would be banned. The problem was obvious. You could throw elbows from any other angle, including spinning or upward, but not that one. The rule became infamous in 2009, when Jon Jones dominated Matt Hamill, only to lose by disqualification after landing illegal 12-6 elbows. That remains the only official loss on his record. For years, fighters and fans complained. Finally, in July 2024, the unified rules were updated to remove the universal ban. Some states still enforce it, but across most commissions, 12-6 elbows are legal again. It took decades, but one of MMA's weirdest restrictions finally died. Dennis Hallman's Speedos. One outfit changed the dress code forever. At UFC 133, Dennis Hallman walked into the octagon wearing bright blue Speedos. Not compression shorts, not board shorts, actual tiny Speedos. Apparently, he lost a bet and followed through. The reaction was instant. The crowd laughed nervously. Fighters on Twitter roasted him. Dana White was furious. To make things worse, Hallman's opponent Brian Ebersol had an arrow shaved into his chest hair, pointing down. The combination turned the fight into one of the most awkward spectacles in UFC history. Hallman was TKO'd in the first round. Dana was so relieved it ended quickly that he gave Ebersol a $70,000 bonus for getting that guy off TV fast. Hallman never fought in the UFC again. That single fight forced the UFC to update its dress code. From that moment, fighters had to wear approved gear only. No more Speedos, no more gimmicks. Hallman had a solid MMA career before that. But today, if you Google him, the first image you see is those infamous blue shorts. That's his legacy, for better or worse.